All right. Welcome, everybody. And thank you so much for being here this afternoon for the lecture series. If this is your first time for the member lecture series, I hope you take advantage of it if you're a member. And if you're not, you've paid $10 to attend. So thank you for that. But you can attend all of our lectures going through. We plan on having these almost every single week. And we already have it's scheduled almost all the way through Thanksgiving time. So, this is a new benefit that we're adding to for members. So if you're not a member, I hope you become a member and you'll be able to attend even more lectures overall. Today is the first of our unknown influence of New Orleans music, and we're going to have 6 weeks of lectures with this theme. And Dr. Charles Chamberlain and Dave Thomas, who are both musicians and tour guides, and Charles teaches at UNO, and a former historian at the stadium. So we're going to be talking about that for about 6 weeks. So I enjoy this. And with that, Charles is going to talk 19th century composers of New Orleans, a very unusual topic that I'm really excited to hear more. So thank you so much, Charles.
Great, thanks, Jason, and welcome everyone. And I want to let you all know that I'm a professor of New Orleans music history at University of New Orleans. And as Jason mentioned, also I was the historian for the Louisiana State Museum for about 10 years, from 2002 to 2012. And so tonight, or this evening, I'm going to present the topic, which is in the unknown music series, or lesser known music series of 19th century composers of New Orleans. And then I've subtitled it Nouvelle Orléans, Première Musicale City of North America. So essentially the premier musical city of North America in terms of music. And so if y'all would, if y'all are ready to begin, I'm ready to go. So here we go. So as most of my lectures, I usually begin with really a guidance in terms of further reading and research. And so just going through the list really quickly, there's S. Frederick Fred Starr's book, Bamboula, The Life and Times of Louis Moreau Gottschalk, published in 1994. And then later republished as the title Louis Moreau Gottschalk in 2000. And Louis Moreau Gottschalk, as we'll discover, is one of the premier composers of this period. And then an amazing article that I still use in my New Orleans music history class is Lester Sullivan's Composers of Color of the 19th Century in New Orleans, in the Black Music Research Journal, published in 1998. And then Lester Sullivan was the archivist at Xavier University, and I would consider him posthumously the expert on that subject. And so this large part of the subject matter tonight. And then another article is Lawrence Gauchy's 19th Century Origins of Jazz, and also in the Black Music Research Journal in 1994. Lawrence Gauchy, one of the premier historians of early jazz and the connections of late 19th century music to early jazz. And so both these articles are, I would consider, essential in terms of understanding this. And then also the Hogan Jazz Archives at Tulane University, and especially their Jazz Archivist newsletter, with numerous articles by especially the historian Jack Stewart, who specializes in a lot of these composers from the late 19th century, early 20th century, and the transition from ragtime to jazz. So as you see to the right, I have the cover for Fred Starr's Bamboula, and then also a photograph of Melissa Weber, who is currently the curator of the Hogan Jazz Archives. And I just noticed, I went to research tonight some of these articles, and I was not able to research them. And I don't know if Tulane has cut off their previous ability to find some of these articles, but if you can't find them, just go to Hogan and they are there. So anyway, to start off, Louis Moreau Gottschalk and Bambula. This is kind of the grand start. So Louis Moreau Gottschalk, the great composer of the earliest part of the 19th century, and Bambula, which is his greatest composition and also the name of his biography, as we mentioned, by S. Frederick Starr. So anyway, I wanted to move on. Gottschalk, his significance in early life from 1829 to 1843. So his significance is New Orleans pianist, performer, and composer with an international fame, considered the first composer to infuse European and African music traditions, thereby creating an American style, and then first international music star from New Orleans, also a product of his environment. And so he was born in 1829 in New Orleans, died in 1869 at a rather young age of 40 in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, after touring essentially the world for most of his adult life. And so Gottschalk has a really interesting background in that his father was Edward Gottschalk, who was a German Ashkenazi Jew from London, and he moved to New Orleans in the early 19th century. And he also had a second family with a free woman of color in New Orleans, which is not quite uncommon. And then his mother is Aimée Marie Bousselet, who's a French Creole from Saint-Domingue, which is today's Haiti. And so also, which is very interesting, is Gottschalk was raised by a Afro-Creole woman named Sally from Saint-Domingue. And it's considered important in terms of the music that she passed on to him when he was growing up as a young child. And he grew up in the French Quarter de Vauquois, in a Creole cottage at Royal and Esplanade, which is featured here to the right. It's a very obvious corner in the French Quarter. If you're driving down Esplanade Street, right at Royal, you'll see that right there. And then later they moved to a townhouse at 518 Conti Street, which is between Charters and Decatur. And so both these houses are significant in terms of representing his French Quarter upbringing. And then moving on to his youth. So Gottschalk studied piano formally and emerged as a child prodigy in New Orleans and as an adolescent. And then he made his first informal public debut at the St. Charles Hotel in 1840. And so the St. Charles Hotel was kind of the premier hotel in the uptown region. At that time, New Orleans was the third biggest city in the U.S. And so the St. Louis Hotel on St. Louis Street between Charters and Royal was very popular in the French Quarter. And then the St. Charles Hotel was also very popular further uptown in the 200 block of St. Charles, where Place St. Charles is today. So at age 13, Gottschalk moved to France, and you can imagine a 13-year-old moving to France to enroll in the Paris Conservatory or Conservatoire, but he was rejected because of his nationality as an American. So it was part of this French bias. He performed well at the newly built 3,000-seat Salle Pleyel, and so that's named after the Pleyel Piano Company. And as a result, he was recognized for this performance and composition talents by two of the greatest stars of the day, and that is Frédéric Chopin and Franz Liszt. And reflecting his efforts to create a local color composition, and that is, at the time, at the mid-19th century, local color referred to a movement in music and also literature where artists would create a piece that reflected the specific culture of their local area. And so, for example, Mark Twain might be considered representative of the upper Mississippi, upper Mississippi Valley. And so when Gottschalk moved to Paris, and then he heard Liszt and Chopin, he said, "Well, what could I draw upon in my own childhood, in my own local culture, to create a local color composition?" And so he basically created Bamboula, Danse des Nègres, so Dance of the Blacks in 1848, and then published in 1849. And then he also created Creole pieces such as La Savane, which we're going to hear in just a minute. So, and just in general, conjecture has been made as to the origins and the influence of Congo Square performances on Bamboula. And so Bamboula incorporates, we'll get into it in a minute, but incorporates African rhythms. And so considering that that Gottschalk was raised in the French Quarter, you know, the question is asked, how much did the culture of Congo Square influence Gottschalk? And so scholars, especially Frederick Starr, believe it was largely based on the Creole folk song from Saint-Domingue, Quand patate la cuite, when the potato is cooked. And Frederick Starr has done a lot of research, and he thinks essentially that it was his nanny, Sally, who influenced the melody on that. So anyway, we're going to begin with a sample of Bamboula, Danse des Nègres, 1849. So this is Bamboula's, Gottschalk's first composition. So ready to go. So I would like to stop it right there and just kind of narrate the significance of the composition. So in terms of the integration of both European and African styles, this is essentially the rhythm, which is the Bamboula rhythm associated with Congo Square. Again, that was the area associated with Africans gathering on Sundays in the Congo Square area behind the French Quarter, and then also he does a theme and variation in terms of the melody. So don da don 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 da do 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 do. So the melody is a more European melody. The rhythmic variation is very African. So this is why Bamboula is considered really essentially the first modern Western formal composition to integrate these two styles. And what I would like to also point out is that the rhythm, the way he writes it when he was, in his teenage years, is kind of stiff. It doesn't flow like a real dance song. And so later we'll hear, particularly Memoire des Havana, when he goes to Havana, that has much more of a rhythmic flow. And so I wanted to point this out. And so even though this is his most famous song, his most significant song, the rhythm is actually quite stiff. And so I'm going to go ahead and continue here. All right, I'm going to stop it right there. We're going to move on to his next ballad, La Savane, Ballade Creole, published the next year. So, along with Bamboula, the composition La Savane presented an American or Louisiana Creole style to classical music audiences throughout Europe and is considered significant for its contribution to the distinct American cultural identity. So, um, the significance of both of these compositions is that in the local color period, um, when Gottschalk performed these and composed these pieces, basically to European audiences, this presented a unique style that represented America, and then in part because he was from Louisiana, also represented Louisiana. And so the rhythms and the melodies, especially, were more associated with Latin America and Louisiana's connection to the Caribbean. They were not considered particularly American in terms of the style of a Stephen Foster or something more to the north of Louisiana. So I'm going to go ahead and play La Savane. And then also, I'd like to point out that I haven't really read that this is the case, but I think the melody he uses is similar to um, what became in the 20th century the melody of "Skip to My Lou." If y'all know that song, skip, skip, skip to my Lou, skip, skip, skip to my Lou, skip, skip, skip to my Lou, skip to Lou, my darling. So here we go. So I'm gonna stop it right there, but you get the idea in terms of da 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 da. So the skip to my Lou melody, um, and this is where I bring in the Latin and Caribbean travels of Louis Moreau Gottschalk, which is in my opinion, very important. So from 1853 to his death in 1869. So after leaving Europe in 53, he traveled throughout the Caribbean and Latin America, and given his appreciation for local color music in Louisiana, he then absorbed um, all of the styles of this region. And so he performed and studied regional Afro Latin styles and composed new pieces inspired by them, such as Souvenir de la Havana and Souvenir de la Puerto Rico in 1857. And then also he's known historically for performing what is called a monster concert. At the time, he was a great performer, and so a monster concert had a huge orchestra. Um, and over 600 musicians that included Cuban hand drums, which were outlawed at the time, but he thought it was essential to have Cuban hand drums. And then also in the early 60s, he was best known American concert pianist internationally. And in many ways, he was considered the American star of the international circuit. And in terms of today's terms, or maybe the past, he would be considered the American rock star of this time period from the 60s, 1860s. And especially the historic New Orleans collection has his collection of gloves. And so he would come out on stage and fling his glove into the audience, and allegedly the women would go crazy. So he had all the accoutrements of a kind of a rock star lifestyle. And then while on tour in Brazil in 1869, he died from complications from yellow fever, which is not uncommon. Yellow fever was raging throughout most of the world at that time, and then he was buried at the Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York. But what I would like to play now is the Souvenir de la Havana, the memories of Havana. And to me, this is personally my favorite piece from Gottschalk. And then also I love it because I think he's developed so much as a musician that he knows how to write the left hand, the bass of the Afro Caribbean bambula beat. So whereas bambula is do 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 do, it's very stiff. By this time, he's learned to write this bambula beat, so it's much more dance oriented, and the bambula beat is supposed to be dance oriented, and I've often asked my students in my New Orleans music history class, could you dance to this? And so those who dance Latin music always say yes. So here we go. All right, so that's only a third of the way through Memoir Souvenir de la Havane, but we're going to move on to other composers now. So that brings us to the free persons of color composers. and what I would call the unique legacy of New Orleans' 19th century music community. And so um, a few of the composers featured in this category would be Edmond Dede, Eugène Victor Macati, Lucien Léon Lambert, Basile Jean Barres, and Laurent Dubuclet, or Larry Buck. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, so further reading, the best article is by Lester Sullivan, Composers of Color of 19th Century New Orleans and Black Music Research Journal from 1988. And so, again, Lester was an archivist at Xavier University, and this article is by far the premier article on this subject. And he profiles all of these composers in great detail based on his own research. So I would like to start with Edmond Dede, 1827 to 1901. So he is unique and interesting in that he is a descendant of the gens de couleur libre, the free person of color community. And so gens de couleur is a free person of color, and then gens de couleur libre is a free person of color. And so in the French census, this is how they were actually listed as gens de couleur libre, free person of color. And so from the beginning, he was a child prodigy on violin who studied with Ludovico Gabici of the St. Charles Theater and other Creole professors. And the St. Charles Theater was uptown, just upriver from the French Quarter. And then he worked in Mexico from 1848 to 1852. And I would like to say that his career in large part reflects the experience of many free persons of color during this time period of the 20 years leading up to the Civil War, the American Civil War. And that is the restrictions on free persons of color by the white Americans became so strict that many of the free persons of color decided to leave Louisiana and seek employment and residence elsewhere outside the United States. And so Dede is typical of that time period. So he worked in Mexico from 1848 to 1852. He then returned to New Orleans, and then he quickly moved to France in 1857, where he became the conservateur at the Paris Conservatoire, and then he married a French woman, Sylvie Laflette, in 1864, and they had a son, Eugène Arcade Dede, who also followed his father and became a composer of popular songs. But generally, throughout Dede's career, he worked at various theaters in Bordeaux, which is in western France, and ironically, the source of many immigrants who moved to New Orleans, including people like the Lafitte family of John Lafitte, for example. So throughout his career, 1861 to 1901, a long time, 40 years, he worked basically out of Bordeaux. And then what is interesting is he returned to New Orleans once in 1893, and he was embraced by the community of gens de couleur, and that's the free persons of color, and attended 3 concerts at the French Opera House given in his honor by members of the local Comité des Citoyens. So that's the Citizens Committee. And these people were generally dedicated to the idea of civil rights, and these are the people that also fought against the idea of segregation in 1890. And they produced the court case of Plessy versus Ferguson that happened in 1890. So I want to play y'all quickly a couple segments from Edmond Dede. One is Mon Pauvre Coeur, which is My Poor Heart, to give you a sense of his style here.
Je te vois, ô ma blonde créole, sur ton balcon. Je crois voir une vive lionne orner ton front. Et puis enfant, chaque jour je t'adore avec ardeur.
So, a lot of people probably would be somewhat surprised that New Orleans had such a sophisticated compositional community here. And Edmond Day is typical of the sophistication of New Orleans at that time. And I'd like to play quickly his other composition, El Pronunciamiento. And also, I would like to add that if anyone is interested in learning more about these songs that the American Classics has has essentially published these songs on CD, which I believe are available on whatever SoundCloud. So we're going to move on from Edmond Day to Basile Borges, 1845 to 1902. And so what is interesting about Borges is that he was an enslaved person born to a French carpenter, Jean Borges, and based on laws, because his mother was enslaved, Augustine Perrier, he was raised as an enslaved person, but yet he learned music at the Perrier Piano and Music Emporium at 400 Royal, owned by Adolphe Perrier and his wife. And so his first song was Polka des Chasseurs, the polka of the hunters, in 1860, while he was still enslaved at age 15. I mean, that's pretty incredible. And then in 1877, he married Leontine Areza, raised 8 musically educated children in the French Quarter, and led a popular string band for carnival balls in the 1890s. So there's a tradition of carnival crews hiring orchestras to perform carnival balls. And then in the 1870s, Barres and fellow composer Eugene Victor McCarthy, who we listed earlier in terms of important free persons of color composers, organized concerts for Creoles of color and staged a boycott at the French Opera House over the issue of segregated seating. So that was at a time in the late 1870s when the segregation became a kind of an important issue, and so Barres and others, free persons of color, basically staged a boycott of the French Opera House, and so in order to make a point, and so this led to the concert to pay for a French troupe who were stranded by the boycott's financial fallout, and then from the 1870s to the 1890s, he also published 19 pieces in the Grunwald and Junius Hart publishing company, where he worked as a piano repairer and as a music store. Sorry, at the music store. So Barres, a very interesting character, and I'll play you a couple compositions. So Los Campanillos, I think, is very important because it represents the connection to Latin America and just the rhythm of the left hand, especially represents the style of music that one would hear in polite dance circles in Latin America, including Havana and most of Latin America. So. So the left hand on the piano is dong, doo, 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 dong, doo, 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 doo. So that's typical of Gottschalk's Souvenir de la Havane. Dong, doo, 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 doo. So it's typical of New Orleans connection with Latin America. So to me, the Las Campanillas is most significant in terms of this connection. So just to give you a variety, I'm going to play you La Belle Creole. There you go. Very different style. All right, so sorry, but we have to move on. So anyway, Laurence Dubuclet, known as Larry Buck, 1866 to 1909, composer, arranger, orchestra leader. So in the 1880s, he studied with Giovanni Luciano in New Orleans. And then 1890s, he arranged for Paul Cereversol. And then from about 1902 to 1904, he led an orchestra at the Trocadero Theater in the Tango Belt, which is The Taco Belt is the area in the back of the French Quarter, closest to the core of Canal and Rampart. And then finally, in 1903, he moved to Chicago. He anglicized his name to Larry Buck, and then he composed a few compositions, including March Arabia, My Mosey Babe, and Freckles Rag. And so, in terms of New Orleans, he lived at 1006 Curleric between Burgundy and St. Claude Avenue, which is designated as a preservation resource center, a jazz house, as the Dubuclet Residence. And then I would like to play you all quickly some compositions of Lawrence Douglas. So that's the entry to My Mosey Babe. I'm going to go ahead and play Freckles Rag. Here we go. Okay, so enough of that. And that brings up Paul Cerebosol, a French Creole who lived in New Orleans from 1875 to 1911. It's considered a ragtime composer, similar to Larry Buck, Laurence Dubuclet. And he published with the Grunewald Publishing Company. Roustabout Rag, Get On Your Habits On, I've Got Your Habits On, Fires Out, Come Clean. So I wanted to include him, Paul, in terms of all right. So part of why I wanted to show you all this was because the sheet music is often considered offensive, and So anyway, I'm going to end here. This is the end of the presentation. But the legacy of 19th century composers in New Orleans is that number one, they reflected the legacy of New Orleans as a premier city internationally of music. And so, especially in the Western Hemisphere, New Orleans was considered the premier music city, and then also the strong legacy of European formal composition. So um, internationally, again, New Orleans was considered the center of formal composition. Then Gottschalk and Perez, for example, represented the compositions reflected their strong Latin influence and Caribbean influence. And then Three Persons of Color also reflected New Orleans' exceptionalism, also, and the distinct history of the history of Free Persons of Color with their French connections and strong civil rights. And then the ragtime connection compositions reflect the early syncopation rhythms that influenced ragtime and hence early jazz, and represent New Orleans as an early center of ragtime composition and jazz. So, and then lastly, I would say that, and often this is considered most importantly, is that New Orleans composition is really the center of composition in the South. So we're considered the Tin Pan Alley of the South. And a lot of people forget that. A lot of people think that northern places are more important, but I would say that New Orleans is considered more important.
Thank you, Charles. We do have a question right now, and if anybody else has any other questions and you want to put a chat, I'm happy to ask them. Melissa did ask, Gottschalk music reminds her of Scott Joplin's Ragtime.
Yep.
If there's any connection between the two.
Yes, absolutely. So I mean, most of the early ragtime is connected to this type of music that we hear, and so when we think of early like
Okay.
so early Louisiana music, yeah, it's good.
Charles, you okay?
Yep.
So the question was the connection between Joplin and Gott.
Yeah, so the syncopation of Gottschalk is often considered very important with early ragtime. So it's often considered a connection like do 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 do. So, for example, Ned Sublette in his book, uh, "The Music That Made New Orleans," he characterizes all of this music very distinctly, and so a lot of music historians associate the early ragtime with the early the syncopations of New Orleans jazz, and so Most of it is associated with the um, the the rhythms of the syncopated rhythms of the do 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 do, do, which is essentially the rhythms of the tango and most of the early Latin jazz. So I hope that helps.
Let me see if we have any other, we don't have any other questions. With that, we will see you next week, Charles, the 20th at 4 p.m. New Orleans time with the 1920 dance bands. Just to kind of quickly go over, we have the 1920 dance bands on July 20th, the Gibson Sisters on July 27th. Dave Thomas will make an appearance to do his first lecture, The Story of Clarence Williams, on August 3rd. And then August 10th, Charles will be back for the Latin influence of New Orleans music. And then August 17th, the story of Spencer Williams, not related to Clarence Williams, but also a very known but important character in the New Orleans music scene. So with that, I want to thank everybody for being here, and we'll see everybody next week. And thank you very much, Charles.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you.
All right.